Now we get to Melbourne, and like the Crows, I think most Demons fans know that they underperformed this year. But with Melbourne's average experience dropping this off-season and the way they've attacked the draft over recent years, it does seem like they're trying to do a rebuild on the run. My name's Woody, and this is Wooden Spoon Data with the 18th best AFL content on YouTube. And in today's video, we'll be taking a look back at the Demons' best 22 in 2024 to see where they excelled and where they still need to improve. We can also look at the players acquired over the off-season to determine what sort of changes Melbourne might see in 2025 and if that will be enough to get them back to contending and being a top 4 side. To do this, I've made a simple spreadsheet to compare Melbourne's players against the average player in the same position. We can also compare each player against the average top 4 player in the same position over the last 5 years. I have taken some liberties to include best 22 players in the 2024 lineup who missed large chunks of the season through injury, but I've tried to have minimal influence. So basically, I've taken every stat and every position and then compared stats between an average player in a given position and a top 4 player from the last 5 years in the same position to determine what stats are important for each position.
Positions!
For example, Christian Petrarca had 37 out of 42 important stats above the average midfielder this year. But that drops to 33 out of 42 if we were to raise that to the average of a top 4 midfielder over the last 5 years. The average midfielder had 15.91 pressure acts per match this year. Petrarca had 16 and therefore was more than the average 2024 midfielder. But if we were to compare him to a top 4 mid over the last 5 years, where the average has been 17.82, he is lower than the average top 4 mid. Make sense?
Good.
So we did that for every position and every stat we deemed important for each position. Finally, once we determined the best 22 the Ds could field this last year and next, we can compare the players selected as a whole against the average production of a top 4 side over the last few years. So let's start with defence. Melbourne's key defenders this past year were Tom McDonald with 22 games, Stephen May with 19, Jake Lever with 18, and the delisted Adam Tomlinson with 8 matches. With a total of 67 matches played across all their key defenders this past year, we can divide that number by 23 matches and determine the Demons average 2.91 key position defenders played per match and prefer a 3 key position defensive structure. This was easily their best position on the ground, with all players getting 59% or more above that of a top 4 defender. As a side note, I was surprised to see Tomlinson was not picked up, as he seems like a reasonable backup key defender, if nothing else. Looking at important stats above average for key defenders, there isn't too much to worry about here. If I had to be pedantic, I'd say Lever looks to be somewhat exploitable, as he had higher than average 1v1 loss percentage, losing 5.5% more than a top 4 key defender. This is further shown by being below expectations in contested marks, spoils, and tackles. And with a disposal per turnover rate of 5.06 versus 6.46 from a top 4 key defender, it suggests that if the ball does get to ground, he has a higher likelihood of losing it to his opponent or giving the ball back under pressure. But that is being pedantic. Thankfully, Melbourne's defensive structure meant that Lever only averaged 1.72 defensive 1v1s per match. Melbourne did not add a key defender with AFL experience to their list this offseason. In fact, while I'd normally mention it later, former Lions midfielder Harry Sharp was the only player the Demons added with AFL experience that might actually get regular games. So we'll obviously keep the 3 key position defenders still on the list for 2024 and 2025, but I'll also mention now, most positions will have the same players in both years. Now let's move on to Melbourne's medium defenders. This year, Trent Rivers, Judd McVie, Christian Salem, Blake Howes, Taj Woewodin, and Jake Bowie all played over 14 games, with Marty Hoare and Andy Monitz Wakefield playing just the 6 matches. With a total of 121 matches played across all their medium defenders this past year, we can divide by 23 and determine the D's average and prefer 5.26 medium defenders per match. Looking at stats above average, there is an obvious 5 stats-wise that make the team in Rivers, McVie, Salem, Howes, and Bowie, so I'll give them the medium defensive roles. As a side note, I've said this before, but Woewodin's above average stats are affected by the matches he played as a sub, reducing his overall averages. I will have this fixed before predictions next year, but it will take a little bit more time. Considering no one will be changing in defense, we might as well change everyone's numbers to their top 4 above average numbers now. Speaking of, let's have a look at the medium defenders versus top 4 medium defensive comparison chart. I'll start with the positives. Handball receives look to be solid across the board. Same with ground ball gets, intercept possessions, and rebound 50s. There are some stats you'd hope to see some more improvement from next year with the development of the youngsters, and a couple of extra tackles from McVie, Howes, and Bowie would certainly be helpful. That being said, medium defenders are only part of the story, so let's have a look at the defensive unit as a whole. Moving to the overall output, pretty much everything is close to or above target. If we look at score launches again, we can see that this group averaged an extra half a launch per match. We are looking about a tackle and a half less than target, but again, hopefully development from the youth takes care of that too. In fact, besides tackles, only spoils, 1%ers, contested marks, and disposals per turnover were behind a top 4 benchmark. As a general, things look mostly good here, but I would say the higher level of disposals and the lower disposals per turnover suggests they might be overusing the ball in defense and exposing themselves to more turnovers closer to goal. So before we get to the mids, let's quickly touch on the sum of Melbourne's defensive output. In 2024, the sum of the D's defensive output had 24 out of 37 important defensive stats above that of a top 4 defense. Also, despite different stats, that was surprisingly the same result as Brisbane and Adelaide. And while the points against only had a swing of 7.65 between the 3 teams for points against, the difference in these 3 teams can really be seen in the points for average, where there is a swing of 15. Okay, so let's get on to the mids. This year, Christian Petrarca, Jack Viney, Clayton Oliver, Ed Langdon, Tom Sparrow, and Caleb Windsor all played over 13 games, with Lockie Hunter and Kynan Brown playing just the 2 matches. As mentioned earlier, the D's also added former Lion, Harry Sharp, and draftees Harvey Langford and Xavier Lindsay to their midfield stocks this draft. But we'll come back to them in a moment. With a total of 123 matches played across all their midfielders this past year, we can divide by 23 and determine the D's average and prefer 5.35 midfielders per match. Even before looking at top 4 average stats, there was a clear 4 leaders in Petrarca, Viney, Clary, and Ed Langdon. But who else makes the 2024 and 2025 sides? As usual, after the mainstays, we see the drop off from Sparrow, Windsor, Hunter, and Brown. While Sparrow might look like the best option at first glance, when you look at the sum of important stats above an average top 4 team at the end of everything, Sparrow ends up being a -2 if swapped with Windsor, as he has lower marks on lead, shot accuracy, and a couple of the X-score ratings. Sparrow does have better pressure acts with +4.05 over Windsor's 15.63. So that's the 2024 mids lineup. Considering there will be no more changes to there, we'll change everyone's numbers to their top 4 above average numbers. We will be adding 2 midfielders to the 2025 lineup in the recent draftees Langford and Lindsay, but both will be taking spots previously occupied by mid-forwards, so we'll come back to those players in a moment. Firstly, I'm sure you're asking how I'm gonna project Langford and Lindsay's outputs if they haven't played a match yet. First off, good question. I've explained it in previous review videos though, so if you're asking that, go and watch them at the end of this. But secondly, I'm gonna be somewhat lazy.
Hey, this guy's a great big phony!
Because I don't have a good way to project lower level stats to AFL level, I'm gonna take the first year stats of the players that they were compared to prior to the draft. Zero Hanger compared Langford to Mateus Philippou and Lindsay to Sam Flanders, so we'll be taking their first year stats. I said this a few times now, but if anybody has better ideas, I am all ears. So if we look at the players individually, focusing on where to improve, things generally look pretty good across the board for the top 3 mids, which leads me to believe the main issue here is depth. While I know Windsor was playing his first year, he wasn't ahead of any of the top 4 important mid stats. And Langdon, while generally giving more, he was only ahead for handball receives by 0.49. Below them, there wasn't really much to turn to if needed, and we all know there was times where it was needed last year. If we look at that mid group as a whole, while things don't look too bad, the D's averaged 2 more handball receives than a top 4 mid group. When you do delve a little deeper, problems appear.
Problems. Here we go.
One of the major issues I see is disposals and general usage. Being 13 disposals behind an average top 4 mid group is a fair amount, and when you go to usage stats, Melbourne's 5 starting mids were behind a top 4 mid group in kicking, handball, and general disposal efficiency. Inside 50s, rebound 50s, and meters gained too. The Ds are basically bang on target for average goals and shots, so they are doing some things right, but they need to get the ball in the mid's hands more often. Also, I do wonder, with one of the best ruckmen in the league, if not of all time, in Max Gawn, how can they be behind target for centre and total clearances? Tackles should also be better if they're not taking full advantage of Gawn's work too. So, in 2024, the sum of Melbourne's midfield output had only 12 out of 42 important midfield stats above that of a top 4 midfield. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of Melbourne's midfield output would see them slightly move up to 13 out of 42 important stats above that of a top 4 mid group. So clearly this midfield has some crucial areas to improve upon this year, but hopefully a bit more luck health-wise and some natural improvement from the youngsters sees a much greater output. So let's move on to the rucks. Last year, Max Gawn was the only ruckman played, with Van Rooyen getting the second most centre bounce attendances. Melbourne picked up Tom Campbell from St Kilda via the free agency. I don't think he's really challenging for Gawn's role, so we will pick him for both 2024 and 2025. We also can't do much of a comparison here, so we'll jump straight into some of his stats. But before looking at that, as a side note, Gawn has 35 out of 43 stats above the average 2024 ruck, but also had 35 out of 43 above the average top 4 ruck, which is a bit of a rarity, but particularly when a score is that high. Getting to the ruck most important stats chart, Gawn is ahead of target for every stat except 1%ers. I normally wouldn't note this, but in terms of total ruck output, which accounts for the starting ruck and the second ruck, or whoever takes over when the starting ruck rests, Gawn had 22 out of 43, which again is quite rare and particularly high. Looking at the total ruck output chart, we can see he falls behind target in ground ball gets, score involvement, spoils, and overall ruck contests, but man's got a rest, and everything else remains strong. So basically, if you're trying to nitpick, there's not much that you can. So let's look at the forwards and the changes to next year's lineup before we come to any conclusions. Melbourne's key forwards in 2024 were Bailey Fritsch, Jacob Van Rooyen, Harrison Petty, Daniel Turner, Ben Brown, and Josh Schache. Melbourne also picked up mature key forward Aiden Johnson with pick 68 in the national draft. With a total of 86 matches played across all their key forwards this past year, we can divide by 23 matches and determine the D's average and prefer 3.74 key forwards per match. I will only select 3 key position forwards as we're just selecting 22 players, but I also think it works better for balance generally. Also, I do understand Fritsch can play tall and small. I still just think it works better. Clearly Van Rooyen and Fritsch make both the 2024 and 2025 sides, but who makes it beyond them? Quickly touching on the backups, while Turner might look like the best option at first glance, much like Sparrow versus Wilson, it isn't the case, and there is a reason Petty played 20 matches. When comparing the two, Turner ends up being a -3 for the sum of important stats above an average top 4 team. This is because Petty averages slightly more goal assists, intercept marks, and also helps with higher hitouts to advantage than your average second ruck. So while Petty gets in for both the 2024 and 2025 best 22 lineups over Turner, he isn't far off the mark, and with development, I can see that swapping pretty soon. So we've mentioned who will be in the starting 2024 and 2025 roles. Considering there won't be much changes across this position, let's look at the key forwards chart now. In general, I see a couple problems. Not again! There's only one instance which any of these players are above a top 4 key forward. Petty is above target for contested marks by 0.19. And there are reasons for this. Van Rooyen's still young and growing year on year. Fritsch is smaller than a regular key forward and potentially could be classed differently, but he also plays taller than his size. If I'm going to single out specific stats, marks on lead is just well below par, with everyone getting about half of a top 4 key forward. And with lower offensive 1v1s, and as mentioned before, contested marks, this leads to lower score involvements, shots, and therefore goals. So why is this happening? My thoughts are, while perhaps the key forwards aren't taking as much advantage of the opportunities as they should, they also aren't getting as many as other teams. With an average of 49 inside 50s in 2024 and this best 22 lineup only getting 0.4 more, they were 2.8 inside 50s lower than the average 2024 team and 6.57 inside 50s behind the average top 4 team. In my opinion, this can be fairly easily fixed, but I'll save that for conclusions as it requires a bit more of a holistic view. Before comparing total outputs, let's quickly touch on the mid-medium forwards. The mid and medium forwards for the D's this past year were Xavier Pickett, Kay Chandler, Alex Neil-Bullen, and Jack Billings, who all played over 16 matches. With Colton Tholstrup playing 10, Jake Melksham playing 8, Bailey Laurie with 6, Shane McAdam with 3, and Charlie Spargo playing just the 1 match. With a total of 111 matches played across all the Demons mid-medium forwards this past year, again dividing by 23, we can determine the D's average and prefer 4.83 or roughly 5 medium forwards per match. There is a standout 3 in this role being Pickett, Chandler, and Neil-Bullen. Also, I'll just bring it up now, Langford will be taking over Neil-Bullen's role in the 2025 side, but who are the other 2 medium forwards? Melksham and Tholstrup do look better than Billings initially and when compared against a top 4 medium forward. But when you compare the sum of important player stats above an average top 4 team, he still doesn't quite get a role in the 2024 side. Did I get ya? I reckon I got ya.
This is no time for jokes.
Billings does appear to be roughly a net 0 when replacing Tholstrup in the total sum, but that also isn't a reason to go with him over youth. So that's the majority of the 2024 and 2025 lineups, but I did also mention earlier that Lindsay would be taking a spot for one of the benched mid forwards. Due to Melksham's age, Melbourne's more recent preference to blood youths, and a few other factors, he is the one to miss out on the 2025 lineup from the bench. So it's time to have a look at the mid-medium forwards charts. I'll start with the positives, and they are mostly positives. Everyone in the 2024 and 2025 charts is pretty close to or above target in inside 50s, tackles inside 50s, pressure acts, and crumbs. Where I worry is score involvements, shots, and then goals. This again looks to be a problem of players just not getting the ball enough, as we can see with disposals, where Neil-Bullen was the only one averaging more than 14.4. You also have to question if they are doing enough with it when they get the ball. As I mentioned earlier, Melbourne had a goal to inside 50 rate of 23%, which is behind the 2024 AFL average of 23.7% and had them in 11th. So let's look at the forwards' average output as a whole from the 2024 lineup against the projected output from the 2025 lineup. And while most things go down with the loss of Neil-Bullen, there is a reasonable chance that Langford spends more time up forward to start his career, and the stats used reflect that, as we see a slight increase in contested marks, marks inside 50, offensive 1v1s, shots, and goals. That being said, it is a reduction in overall output. In 2024, the sum of Melbourne's forward line output had 23 out of 51 important stats above that of a top 4 forward line. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of Melbourne's forward line output would see them with a minor reduction to 22 out of 51 important stats above that of a top 4 forward line. Considering there was 2 bench spots previously held by mid-medium forwards, with the loss of experience from Neil-Bullen and Melksham too, this 2025 lineup does have a lot of upside.
Huge upside potential with very little downside.
So, before we go over some final numbers, upon reflection, what have we learned? While the defence is solid, with 24 out of 37 or roughly 65% of important defensive stats above a top 4 defence, there are still areas for improvement. If Melbourne's key defenders can look to use their disposals more effectively and get it to their medium defenders to generate more scoring launches from particularly shorter scoring chains, they might see some better returns. I say shorter chains because even though they get good meters gained, it doesn't appear as though they're getting enough overlap disposals to get their midfielders involved. The D's midfield was down on form last year with 12 out of 42 or roughly 29% of important midfield stats above a top 4 midfield. Here too, there are areas for improvement. They just need to get their hands on the footy. And I think it starts with taking more advantage of their ruckman Max Gordon and getting into free space on the rebound 50. When looking at the ruck stats, Gordon has 35 out of 43 or roughly 81% of important ruck stats above a top 4 ruck and 22 out of 43 or roughly 51% above a top 4 ruck group. Honestly, there's not much more he could do as a lone hand, but he probably could use some better assistance than Van Rooyen. With 23 out of 51 or roughly 45% of important forward stats above a top 4 forward line, dropping back by 1 to 22 out of 51 or roughly 43%, there are things to improve here. They kind of just need more opportunities. coming back to inside 50s being about 2.8 lower than the AFL average and 6.5 lower than an average top 4 side, if they were to get that extra 6.5 inside 50s with a 23% goal per inside 50 rate, they would roughly get 1.5 more goals per match, or a minimum of 7 extra points. If we look at the table from before, 7 extra points per match would give them a percentage of 104.4. Also, considering they lost to Carlton by 1 point, Brizzy by 5 points, the Giants by 2, and Port by 7 and 2 points, if we keep it simple and just add 7 points to all those matches, Melbourne finishes with 15 wins, 1 draw, and 7 losses, which would have had them finishing 3rd. In total, we used 70 player stats against a top 4 player in the same role to determine the effectiveness of the 6 different player types that we use. We also used player cumulative averages to see if they surpassed the expected output of a top 4 defence, midfield, ruck line, and forward line to see if the group might work well together or not. Technically, we can look at all those 70 important stats across all lines and see how the whole team fares against an average top 4 side. In 2024, the sum of Melbourne's output had 21 out of 70, or 30% of important stats above that of a top 4 side. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of Melbourne's output would see them with 20 out of 70, or roughly 28% of important stats above a top 4 side.
It keeps getting worse!
So, as a general, I don't think Melbourne gets particularly better or worse in 2025. While I do think they could finish a lot better than this year, like last year, I think it comes down to injuries to their stars, as they're just getting younger and less experienced. I'll do some prediction videos as we get closer to the season, but Willow Ratings has them with a 38.3% chance of making the finals and a 15.1% chance of making the top 4. Thank you for watching our assessment of the Demons 2024 team and some of the changes they've made in the offseason and what that might bring. My name's Woody and this is Wooden Spoon Data. If you like this video, we'd love it if you would subscribe. We're very close to hitting the 1,000 mark now. If you want to see some more AFL data focused content, click that subscribe button. The notification bell will keep you notified. YouTube also suggests some videos on the side here that you might like, so if you're interested, have a look. Thanks again. Have a good day.
How dare you?
Yeah, I gotta call you back. Something amazing is happening.
All you fucking cared about was your stupid bad self. Your numbers are garbage.